up into his nose. The cartilage gave way with a wet snap. The guy screamed, dropping his hands to his face as dark blood geysered through his fingers. The third guy drew a blade, a long, wicked glint of steel catching the neon glare of the bar sign. He lunged. I ripped my heavy wool overcoat halfway off my shoulder, whipping it around my arm like a shield, catching his knife hand in the heavy fabric. I yanked him in close and drove my forehead square into his nose. He went limp, collapsing into a heap in the drift. I stood there, chest heaving, my breath clouding thick in the air. My face was split, my side felt like it was on fire, but I was standing. Two of the hitters were down out cold. The other was groaning on his knees, clutching his ruined face. I walked over to the guy with the knife, planting my heavy boot square on his chest, grinding him into the ice. "Who sent you?" I growled, spitting a mouthful of blood onto his coat. "Talk, or I lead you out here to freeze until the morning shift finds you." He glared up at me, pure venom in his eyes, but I saw the tremor of fear underneath. "You're a dead man, ex-cop," he spat, his blood splattering my boot. "You have no idea what you're stepping into. They've been watching you since you left the diner. You're gonna burn just like that bitch." I pressed down until I heard his ribs groan, but I knew I wouldn't get anything more out of him. They were button men, muscle hired to clean up a leak. But I had my answer. I was compromised. The cartel knew every move I was making. This wasn't a case anymore. It was a survival sprint. Getting out of that alley was a chore. The pain in my ribs had settled into a dull, rhythmic throb, the surefire sign of a fracture or a bad crack. I dragged myself into the Chevy, cranked the heater to blast, and just stared at my hands shaking on the wheel for a full 2 minutes. I needed an ER, but time was a luxury I didn't have. If the cartel knew about my meet with Cruz, the trap was already snapping shut. But the hitter's words about me stepping into something too big gave me a thread to pull. Someone had paid those street dogs, and that someone had access to the patrol logs. Chico was booked within 2 hours of the murder, which meant the frame-up was engineered in real time. I pulled Cruz's envelope out and fished out the scene report. At the bottom of the page was the sweeping, careless signature of the medical examiner who certified the overdose, Dr. Lance Vaughn. I knew Vaughn, an old, whiskey-soaked coroner who'd been cutting meat for the Queen's Morgue for 20 years. He'd lost his conscience somewhere in the 90s, but he usually steered clear of the heavy cartel business. He was too soft for the deep water. For him to sign off on a blatant fake within 2 hours meant he was either terrified or very, very rich. By 5 in the morning I pulled up to his modest colonial home in a quiet pocket of Astoria. The blizzard had slackened to a eerie, drifting crawl. The lights inside Vaughn's place were blazing. That was wrong for a winter dawn. I walked up the porch, my hand resting on my holster. The front door was unlatched, just a fraction of an inch, but the jamb was splintered. My gut told me to back off, but I shoved the wood open with my boot and stepped into the heat. The house was a disaster zone. Overturned drawers, papers strewn across the hardwood like confetti. In the living room stood 2 large Samsonite suitcases, half stuffed with clothes and folders. Dr. Vaughn was right there. He was standing in the center of the room, clutching bricks of $100 bills, frantically trying to jam them into a leather duffel bag. His face was as pasty as the corpses on his tables, beads of sweat dripping from his chin. "Going somewhere, Doc?" I said quietly, closing the door behind me. Vaughn jumped like he'd been hit with a cattle prod. The stacks of cash slipped from his fingers, scattering across the rug. "Vane," he gasped, his voice cracking with terror. What are you doing here? Get out! I don't have time for this." "I see that," I said, stepping forward and planting my boot on one of the hundreds. "One-way ticket to Miami or somewhere farther? Tell me about Elena Cruz's autopsy, Lance. Why did you write it up as an OD when her husband says she never touched a pill in her life?" "I can't say anything," Vaughn shrieked. backing toward the front window. "They'll kill me! They're already here! They're watching the house!" "Who is they, Vaughn? The cartel? Or the cops on their payroll?" I took another step, grabbing the lapels of his rumpled lab coat. The idiot had forgotten to even take it off. "Give me the truth, and maybe I help you get to JFK. What really killed Elena?" Vaugh broke down, a pathetic, sniveling sob, mucus running down his lip. "There were no drugs in her system, Frost," he yelled, unraveling completely. "Pure, clean asphyxiation. She was smothered with something soft, probably a pillow. But they called me. Said if I didn't sign the OD report, my grandkids wouldn't make it to school the next morning. They brought me the cash, guys with gold shields, Silas. It was our guys from the big house." I went cold. The missing link. The cartel and the NYPD hadn't just crossed paths. They were sleeping in the same bed. This wasn't local graft. It was a syndicated operation where police badges were being used to sanction executions. And right then, the dawn silence was shattered by a sharp, dry snap. Shatter. The large picture window right behind Vaughn exploded into a million glittering teeth. A neat, small hole punched through the center of the doctor's forehead, followed by a dark crimson spray that painted the wallpaper behind him. His eyes rolled back into his skull, and his heavy frame hit the floor like a sack of wet cement, right on top of his bloody cash. "Sniper." I hit the floor instantly, throwing my arms over my head as a second round chewed through the drywall right above me, showering my neck in white plaster dust. Crap ran through my brain. They were cleaning house, and I was next on the ledger. I scrambled behind a heavy oak sofa, my breathing ragged. The shooter was on the roof across the street. I tracked the angle of the entry holes. Trying the front door was suicide. The living room was a fishbowl. Then the faint wail of sirens echoed down the block. But it wasn't the cavalry. They were moving too fast, arriving too neatly. 2, 3, 4 cruisers. They weren't coming to investigate a shooting. They were coming to box me in and pin Vaughn's murder on the road ex-cop. Disgraced Private Eye Vane Murders City M.E. It was a beautiful headline for the morning edition. I had to move. I crawled on my belly toward the kitchen, where a small window faced the rear alley. Every slide forward sent a spike of white fire through my fractured ribs, but the adrenaline was burning out the fear. The glare of high beams was already cutting through the shattered front window, casting long, frantic shadows across the ceiling. I heard tires crunch on the ice outside, followed by the slam of doors and shouted commands. "Secure the perimeter! Check the back alley!" I had seconds. I stood up in the kitchen, hurled a wooden chair through the small window pane, and without looking, threw myself out into the dark of the snow-covered backyard. I hit a deep drift, which saved my legs but rattled my spine. A sniper round clipped the chain-link fence inches from my ear with a vicious ping. I scrambled up, vaulted the gate, and sprinted down the dark, freezing alleyways, losing myself in the whiteout of the storm that was rising again, wiping my tracks from the face of the city. I rode out the worst of the morning in a derelict rail yard down by the Red Hook docks. The hours bled together in a blur of shivering and sharp stabbing pain. I stripped off my shirt and bound my ribs tight with a roll of heavy-duty duct tape I kept in the Chevy's glove box. It compressed the bone enough to let me draw a breath without groaning. The face looking back at me in the rearview mirror was a mess of purple bruising and dried blood, but nobody was handing out medals for looking good. I needed to figure out how the cartel was staying half a step ahead of me. The alley in Queens, the sniper in Astoria, they had a roadmap of my routine. Someone was feeding them from the inside. But who? Cruz. It made no sense. He was the one who pulled the pin on this grenade. His life was already in ashes. I pulled out Dr. Vaughn's personal cell phone, which I'd lifted from his coat before leaping out his kitchen window. The burner was a cheap flip phone, but the call log was active. One specific number had pinged him half a dozen times over the last 48 hours. I knew that exchange by heart. It was a direct extension inside Brooklyn Homicide. Detective Marcus Miller's desk, Cruz's partner. But the real knife in the dark was waiting on the thumb drive Cruz had handed me inside the diner. His personal cache of surveillance notes and wiretap logs he'd been hoarding through his own rogue sources. I slotted it into my ruggedized laptop, running off the car's cigarette lighter. I started parsing Cruz's personal phone logs, and that's when the shocking twist dropped me into a deeper chill than the winter outside. I stared at the glowing monitor, and the cold that settled into my chest had nothing to do with the draft coming through the Chevy's floorboards. It was the absolute crushing weight of total realization. The leak hadn't come from a squad room. Well, not the way we thought. The cartel knew everything because Cruz himself had accidentally given them the keys. His personal cell phone had been tagged with a commercial-grade spyware tap months ago. Every single call he made, every word he whispered to Elena about his investigation, every threat he leveled at the syndicates, it was being intercepted and routed straight to Los Negros. Cruz had built the highway that brought the killers right to his own front door, and he didn't even know he was driving. But the filthiest part of the truth was buried deeper in the audio files Cruz had intercepted from the cartel's proxy servers, thinking they were just gangster chatter. I clicked on a random WAV file. A familiar voice filled the cabin of the car. It wasn't a Spanish accent. It was the thick, unmistakable Brooklyn drawl of Marcus Miller, Cruz's partner, the guy Ray called a brother, the guy he'd shared 1,000 midnight coffees with, the guy who'd covered his back in a dozen dark doorways. "She's alone," Miller's voice said on the tape. He sounded relaxed, casual, like he was ordering a pepperoni pie. "Cruz is on the overnight shift. I'm keeping him buried under case files at the precinct. The spare key is under the planter, same as always. Keep it clean. No blood. Just scare him enough to make him forget the docs exist." "You sure about this, Miller?" a second voice replied, deep and gravelly. "If Cruz finds out, you're the first one in the ground. He won't find out. He's too stupid, too busy playing the righteous crusader. Just grab her jewelry so it tracks like a burglary, and make sure the patrol guys get paid off to pick up Chico on the corner." The audio caught to a dead hiss. I closed the laptop. My fingers were stiff from the cold, but my blood was boiling. The world was a hell of a lot more rotten than I'd given it credit for. The man Cruz trusted with his life was the very monster who'd turned the key to Elena's bedroom. Miller had let the wolves in. He'd sold her out for a stack of clean bills and a comfortable retirement on the cartel's ledger. Everything clicked. The cartel knew about me because Miller had tracked Cruz to that payphone or flagged my Chevy at the diner. They wanted to bury the whole damn slate, which meant me, Cruz, and anyone else who could disrupt their multi-million-dollar cocaine pipeline through the ports. I knew my clock was running out of ticks. It wouldn't take long for Miller or his cartel handlers to realize I'd